Welcome to the 3Rs, my other podcast on reality, reason, and rationality. Today, I'm coming to you from the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia. So you'll be hearing the sounds of nature around me as I am literally in the bush somewhere, surrounded by insects, including ants beneath me and crickets above me, and all around by the bushland of the mid-northern part of Queensland. As the title suggests, today I'm talking about Trump's executive orders. How is the state to be constituted so that bad rulers can be got rid of without bloodshed, without violence? End quote. So asked Karl Popper in a number of places, not least of which in The Economist in a 1988 article easily found by Google if you just look for Karl Popper, the archives, The Economist. Popper's question was to highlight that the more traditional question in political science of who should rule was misguided and led to perverse answers, such as, in Plato's case, philosopher kings, an expert class. Karl Popper's idea was that democracy should not be regarded as rule by the majority, but rather as a system of error correction, where elections allowed a process of voting out rulers who the ruled thought were bad. And therefore, that whole process in politics resembled the process that happens in science, where experiment can rule out theories that cannot explain reality. The logic, therefore, was the same. It's a form of modus tollens, technically, which is if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. In other words, if the Republicans are better rulers, then they make better rules. Republicans don't make better rules, then they are therefore not better rulers. So vote them out. In the last election in the United States, the rule decided this logic did not hold for Republicans but rather Democrats, and they were roundly voted out. This, on Popper's view, is not an endorsement of how wonderful the Republicans must be, but rather how the Democrats were worse and therefore should have failed. Now the Republicans have a chance to make better rules. Will they? At the executive level, the President of the United States is uniquely powerful. Indeed, for members of allied nations such as the United Kingdom and Australia, we possess nothing quite like the possibility of such wide-ranging and deep power in a single person as the President of the United States. In our nations, as most places in the Westminster system so-called, the head of the government, the Prime Minister, is positively weak by comparison. And this is the way we like it. I shall come back to this. But is there a way of comparing different democratic systems? On Talkcast, I spent most of my time creating content that has nothing to do with the news cycle or politics of the day. Here at the 3Rs, reality, reason and rationality, I allow myself the indulgence when there is interesting crossover with my interest in the topic of under what conditions does society flourish, progress accelerate and change happen rapidly whilst a society is able to remain stable. Trump has recently, we have been told, done a lot. This is rapid change, it appears, by any metric. Could this cause instability, or is instability already here? Perhaps the mass migration that is occurring, in particular where immigration is happening in some places supposedly too quickly, according to many commentators, in places where there exist welfare states in particular, perhaps that is already causing places that were once stable havens of progress to regress. The incomparable Douglas Murray has claimed societies are like fragile ecosystems. And for this reason, we must be careful about upsetting the balance of people and cultures we introduce, particularly into the West, and with what rapidity. Now, Murray is onto something here. Many societies are fragile and have failed precisely because of a species of fragility due to rigidity, an inability to adapt to change, whether environmental or cultural. Those are societies that tend towards stasis. Think tribal societies or those ruled over by a theocracy where scientific and technological progress happens rarely, if at all. However, our society in the West, which exists in the tradition of the Enlightenment, is far from fragile. It, like all societies, contains knowledge both explicit and inexplicit about how to remain in existence. But our society is able to adapt to change. Our problem, therefore, is not so much about the number of people who are not raised Western or in the Enlightenment tradition who we introduce or import from outside, but rather the ideas that cross our borders that we'd prefer did not take hold. Our society is unique, and unique in history because it is singularly not rigid. It is flexible. It is designed to be maximally flexible whilst retaining its existence and capacity to incorporate new people and ideas. Of course, no society can tolerate unlimited change at an unbounded rate, but the knowledge contained within our culture and institutions, all of which, in truth, are contained within our minds in any given generation, makes our society especially resilient. Resilience is a remarkable quality of knowledge, something Chiara Marletto has reflected on in her first book on constructive theory titled The Science of Can and Can't. This notion of resistance, in a single word, captures the quality, a special kind of information that gets itself copied from mind to mind, generation after generation, as memes. In the Enlightenment tradition, which has been explained by Karl Popper and David Deutsch as a tradition of criticism, a curious tradition, as traditions traditionally have hitherto been about maintaining the status quo. However, a tradition of criticism maintains and even fosters change, indeed a special kind of change, rapid progress, even accelerating progress. But rapid progress or change on its own is typically unstable. Yet our society, since the beginnings of the Enlightenment in the 1700s or earlier, starting in the Netherlands, Scotland and England, has been remarkably stable, evolving like a biological clade. We can look to history to see the origins of free speech, free trade and the free vote, which is to say a proliferation of creativity, wealth and democracy, and in that order, across the nations we now associate with the West, stretching from its origins in far Western Europe, across parts of Eastern Europe, and all the way to parts of Asia, more recently including South Korea and Japan, as well as Northern America and the Pacific region like Australia and New Zealand. The West is not a place, but a gradually growing set of ideas and increasingly similar cultures. Cultures being defined as groups of memes or ideas that cause people to behave in similar ways. All of this is to say, we in the enlightened and enlightening West should expect rapid change. And rapid change can happen for good or ill. Our institutions and ideas, the tradition of criticism I have already mentioned, is an engine that helps sift good ideas from bad, using the 3 prongs of liberty stated above: free speech, free trade, and the free vote. These are systems of error correction. Made an error in what you've said or expressed? Take it back, change your mind, correct, and move forward. Made an error in your purchase or what job you've taken or person you've hired? Return it, resign, or fire that person. No one will tend to coerce you in a society that tends more towards free trade capitalism. And what agitates people most of all right now? Made an error in electing some leader? Just wait until the end of their term and you, like everyone else, can correct your mistake by voting them out. That, after all, is the purpose of elections, to vote out rulers who end up making rules you do not like, or failing to make rules you'd prefer they did or promised to. It is not a method for finding the best or ideal rulers. There can be no such, any more than the final truth will ever be found in science. New scientific explanations are like grand but unsupported scaffolds around reality we climb upon like children on monkey bars, allowing us to glimpse vistas of ever more problems to solve, new and better opportunities to make progress, to understand things we didn't even know we should or could understand before making that little bit of progress and understanding something of the nature of the truth about reality. Again, no idea or explanation is perfect. No leader will be perfect. No product perfect. Hence, this need for what is in the Enlightenment that allows us to discard choices we think we've made in error and make a different choice. But within the West, there is diversity. Diversity as our strength has become a mantra much derided, and yet there is truth in it. Within a biological species, there is diversity. The more diverse the individuals within a biological species, the greater the variation, it is said, the stronger it tends to be. As the environment changes, members of the species may die off, but in a diverse species, some members will have just the right mutation or variation to weather the change, survive and have offspring. This is how evolution happens. But in biological species, this is all mechanical and physical and extremely slow. Hence, species go extinct all the time. Something like 99.99% of all species that have ever existed on planet Earth have gone extinct. So too, approximately for societies of humans, almost all of them have gone extinct. But in our case, as I've already said, societies in the Enlightenment tradition are resilient and survive change, and they even expect and welcome it now. Just a note. What is often gathered under the umbrella of the Enlightenment also came out of French and German philosophy at the same time as what was going on in England, Scotland, and the Netherlands. However, on the continent, the continental Enlightenment, many ideas that were explicitly anti-Enlightenment, such as Immanuel Kant's ideas about the purpose of government, they were anti-liberal in many cases. Historian Roy Porter has written and spoken extensively about the two Enlightenments, the Scottish versus the continental Enlightenment. And the latter, the continental Enlightenment, was opposed in many ways to the liberty-loving tendencies of the former. Anyway, within our Western societies, there exists diversity at the level of government systems. England, for example, very gradually evolved the modern Westminster democratic system. There, now, the monarch has been diluted of basically all power. They do not make rules, and thus the king or queen are not strictly rulers. So there is no need to vote them out. That is not the measure of a good democracy. Democracy is judged by the criterion of the extent to which rules and rulers can be changed by the ruled without violence. England's system is a shining beacon of that, where now prime ministers are routinely removed even by their own party with some regularity. In Australia, which has a slightly adapted variation upon England's system, elections are very often called early at the federal level, and the society flips wildly and frequently between one party and another, holding sway for just a few years at a time. This is rapid error detection and correction in the realm of politics. It is a form of government testing, then refuting, creating, then criticising. Politicians know this can happen, and so do the citizens. The Prime Minister, ostensibly the most powerful person in the land, really is always on thin ice, and they know it. They cannot afford, by edict, to issue executive orders, as the President of the United States can, for a Prime Minister is exceedingly easy to remove by comparison. The same cannot be said, for example, for the French President, or even the South Korean President, as recent events have proven. There, to be removed, impeachment proceedings must be held. It is a slow legal process, often involving courts and two-thirds majorities in senates or congresses and so on. No simple majority vote of the members of their own party will do it. And in both cases, the presidents have awesome, unparalleled power in their own nations. The executive branch there basically is the president. And in the United States, the president has more power still in many respects. For those in Westminster systems, such as throughout the Commonwealth nations, those which were once British colonies in the main, but not exclusively, the Prime Minister has nothing like the power of a president. Again, they can be in power in the morning and gone by the afternoon should a simple majority of their own party disagree with them. And so there is nothing like executive orders that Prime Ministers can sign. Ministers in the Australian system must be serving politicians, sometimes appointed by the Prime Minister, sometimes by the ruling party. They cannot be brought in from outside to head up departments as secretaries, such as the US President can do with his heads of department. For a long time in US politics, apparently, this ability for presidents to wield the power of executive orders was seen more as an exception to regular lawmaking rather than custom and tradition. But things have changed. Many trace its accelerating rate of use to recent decades. Each side blames the other for the ratcheting up of the use of executive power in government, and in any case, Trump noticed all of this custom, this new custom, and how effective it has been, and was elected in no small measure on the expectation he would also part ways with something like the first 200 years or so of the Republic to use the executive order to make radical changes swiftly. And shouldn't we regard all of that as being perfectly in accord with the Enlightenment? Rapid change tempered by the customs and institutions that maintain social stability? We shall see in the months and years to come. It is an interesting experiment to see how far the pendulum can swing and how quickly, and whether the whole mechanism will sway too. We live in accelerating times, after all. People in the 2020s don't merely expect, respect and welcome change. They actually seem to want it faster than it's occurring, and are sometimes disappointed at its unprecedented rate. The next large language model, ChatGPT or whatever, is never fast or good enough, no matter how fast the iterations come and how blown away most of us are by its reasoning capabilities. We are all becoming, like comedian Louis C.K. said,
everything is amazing right now and nobody's happy. I was on an airplane and there was internet, high-speed internet on the airplane. That's the newest thing that I know exists. And I'm sitting on the plane and they go, open up your laptop, you can go on the internet. And it's fast and I'm watching YouTube clips. I'm in an airplane. And then it breaks down. And they apologize, the internet's not working. The guy next to me goes, this is bull. Like how quickly the world owes him something he knew existed only 10 seconds ago.
Right.
Flying is the worst one because people come back from flights and they tell you their story. And it's like a horror story. They act like their flight was like a cattle car in the 40s in Germany. That's how bad they make it sound.
Right.
They're like, it was the worst day of my life. First of all, we didn't board for 20 minutes.
Right.
And then we get on the plane and they made us sit there on the runway for 40 minutes. We had to sit there. Oh, really? What happened next? Did you fly through the air incredibly like a bird? Did you partake in the miracle of human flight, you non-contributing zero?
We could all do with pausing and appreciating the wonders of the Enlightenment and the accelerating enlightenment we are experiencing. Now, it's true that in many countries, amplified by social media, each side of politics has been going apoplectic at even the thought of the other side enacting policies they simply mention out loud. And when some policies are enacted, anyone would think it truly is the end of civilization. We exist, as David Deutsch has observed, in a peculiar age of hyperbole. Nothing is quite so bad, except in places where it truly is terrible, and then sometimes things are downplayed. Take October 7th, 2023. The worst atrocity against the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And yet, if we look at the reaction on the left and parts of what Konstantin Kisin has called the woke right, anyone would think it was just another skirmish in a war where there is blame on all sides. Never in the history of human conflict has there been such a bright line between good and evil, conjoined with a tendency to confuse the two and both sides the issue. But what about the Palestinians and their suffering? Aren't the IDF going too far and being reckless? That's the refrain you hear from people like Piers Morgan, who regards the fact he takes heat from both sides as a sign he is doing something right, rather than completely wrong. So what about Indeed? The people who largely voted in Hamas share their genocidal ideology and have been allowed again and again to support terrorists among them and raise their children to do the same generation after generation. What about them Indeed? All of that is waved away as if the Jews have caused this, just as supposedly it was the Jews who drove Hitler and the Nazis to extremis, an increasingly popular refrain among the historically illiterate on social media. The Jews have been blamed since time immemorial, as David Deutsch has observed in his calling out of the pattern, which I've written about at some length at Colette. Check my Substack article where you're listening to this for links. People are confused about the Enlightenment and its enemies. They are confused about how to defend not merely their own nations, but the set of ideas broadly that allow for nationhood to persist, providing safety and the opportunity for improvement. They don't know what the Enlightenment is, and in some cases, where they do, reject it outright. There are, therefore, enemies within as well as without. Some may be innocently mistaken or not, but they can be a danger to individuals and society because anti-Enlightenment forces tend in the direction of coercion and ultimately violence. They reject the possibility of fruitful but peaceful confrontations between ideas because anti-Enlightenment movements tend to be utopian in their outlook. They think there are ways of organising society which are optimal, and will therefore use force to insist on a perfect organisation of society rather than expecting failure from time to time, due to the very nature of trial and error embedded within our Enlightenment traditions. And this, by the way, is one of the distinctions to be made between the English, Scottish and Dutch Enlightenments, true Enlightenments, hereafter I'll simply refer to it as the Enlightenment, versus the Continental Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a recognition, in retrospect, of the inability of people to reach a perfect state, for there is no perfect state, and therefore society must always be in a state of flux and improvement. The notion that error and missteps are inevitable in the creation of knowledge, technology and improved morality is built into the philosophy underlying how we have set up our governments and institutions. For this reason, discussion should always be attempted in order to improve our ideas. Among philosophers from Kant to Rousseau and others on the European continent, there was quite an adept critique of traditional religious authoritarian ways of coming to knowledge and organising society. But their failure was in seeking to replace those authorities and tyrannies with a more secular or supposedly egalitarian version. They believed in the power of the state to provide rights to the populace, rather than the state protecting the rights inherent to human beings. They taught how it might be possible in any case, with a careful application of the mind, to reach certainty, and so therefore dogma was never entirely rejected by them. They replaced religion, but not quite religious thinking. that ultimate final truth could be found, perhaps by science or reason more broadly, and hence the initiation of violence justified in some cases to perfect the world. They were not fallibilists in the Popperian sense. It is no accident, therefore, that out of this philosophical confusion sprang French postmodernism and similar movements such as cultural relativism and the very modern impulse to regard all societies and cultures everywhere as more or less equal. Who are we to judge another people? Well, who would we be to withhold judgment? Relativists, of course. And that is something the Enlightenment rejects. There is an objective difference between knowledge and ignorance, good and evil, or better and worse explanations. And for this reason, we can judge everything from scientific explanations through to competing national policies and ethical guidelines in light of objective standards of clarity. Moral realism, what preserves the means of error correction, and the generation of better, higher quality knowledge. So let us take all that as background knowledge and survey the timely issue of Donald Trump's recent executive orders. I am, of course, an outsider, not a US citizen, and I've already indicated that the very notion of executive orders might be a fraught one. One reason for the existence of the checks and balances, that is the tension between the executive, the Congress and the Supreme Court in the USA, is to slow down a government's capacity to do anything, which is to say, do too much damage too quickly. But the executive order seems to cut right through this gridlock in many cases. Gridlock being a feature, not a bug, of a system many people think is excellent, as it gives time for politicians and regular citizens to reflect upon, debate and raise, perhaps unthought of, objections to rules being made and policies being set. In any case, putting all that aside, the reality is that the President of the United States has passed many executive orders very swiftly and publicly, and these have an effect not merely in the USA, but on the wider culture of the Enlightenment and certainly the discussions happening across the world. So it is not out of place for an Australian to remark once more as an outsider what this looks like in light of the background of Enlightenment ideas, checks and balances and critical thinking. As of February 7th, 2025 in Australia, Donald Trump has signed 50 executive orders according to NBC News. That's a lot in a small amount of time, more than any of his predecessors. However, Clinton signed 364, Bush 291 and Obama 276. Trump in his first term only signed 220. Biden apparently only signed 162. So there has been a trend downwards. Let's select not all 50, but just some that have generated the most publicity and see if any themes or consistency with the above criteria arise, and we can check it against whether or not these things are good policy. All of the ongoing presidential orders are being catalogued at www.whitehouse.gov/presidential-actions/. We begin in foreign affairs, and the Department of State and foreign policy broadly is to be brought in line with an America First idea behind MAGA. On the one hand, this is simple common sense. All national governments should prioritise their own nations. The Japanese government puts Japan first, the Saudi government puts Saudi Arabia first. On the other hand, nations in the tradition of the Enlightenment should not forget their allies and to defend those means of error correction around the world. The MAGA movement would do well not to tend in the direction of pure isolationism and nationalism. Nationalism being my country right or wrong. But rather they should recognise that patriotism, a love for one's country, is only strengthened by defending one's allies in the West broadly. If the USA to retreat much, or much more, from being the preeminent power in the world and from defending its allies militarily, from Israel to South Korea, Japan, Europe and Australia and so on, it may find that if some or many of these allies were to fall to Chinese or Russian influence, to communism more broadly, or Islamism or other nefarious ideologies, America First would be that much more weakened by its very own impulse. However, the executive order I'm talking about here, which is the executive order titled America First Policy Directive to the Secretary of State, is light on detail. Moving on to the directive to utilise the military, this is an executive order to defend the borders of the United States, is consistent with the very existence of a nation itself. A nation is defined by its borders, or rather, more precisely, a country is. A common sense reading of the situation in the USA is that that country is so attractive a place, no one is fleeing it, but many are breaking in. As we defend the walls of our home and define our private property with a fence, so too our country with borders. This is simply realism. If one agrees there exist countries, then one agrees there exist borders between them. And whatever the immigration policy is, people should not simply be permitted to cross the borders without checks. This in no way suggests that immigrants as a rule are detrimental to society or social cohesion or anything of the sort. It is a realistic acknowledgement that if even some minuscule percentage of people who come into the country to settle do not merely not share the values of the host nation, but are actively hostile to it, it multiplies the problems in that society and threatens innocent individuals. It is also an acknowledgement of the fact that even if the overwhelming majority of immigrants are net contributors to the economy because of their productive output and creativity, if some small number of immigrants are not, and they enter a country like the United States, where forms of welfare exist for recent arrivals, or where those crossing the borders may have been literally expelled from their home countries for being criminals, it is an absurd abrogation of reason to have a porous border. Hence, if civilian authorities have been unable or unwilling to effectively seal the border, let the military do it. Moreover, as a visitor to places like the United Kingdom and the United States, I can attest to the great difficulty of simply visiting those nations, passing through customs and immigration, often paying money for visitation rights. In the US, it's a non-visa visa, called an ESTA. This is a form most citizens of countries with good relations with the USA must fork over good money for. Any law-abiding potential immigrant who waits in the queue, as it were, must be frustrated, especially when places are limited, and perhaps further limited, by those who enter illegally. Moving on to the executive order, which is declaring a national energy emergency. So here we have hyperbole on the one hand. There is no risk of the USA running out of energy or facing energy shortages. However, that said, the cost of energy across the world is too high because of global energy policy, poor policy directed at protecting the planet rather than facilitating the flourishing of humans. Hence, the content of this order, which reads in part to, quote, facilitate the supply, refining and transportation of energy in and through the west coast of the United States, northeast of the United States and Alaska, end quote, is a clear pivot back towards cheap, reliable fossil fuels, which can power cars and the grid rather than the transition to unreliable so-called renewable energy sources. Although scientific realism teaches us that fossil fuels are actually limited, we have not approached the limit yet, and have potentially thousands of years of global reserves of oil, gas and or coal. We should exploit these for the benefit of all people across the world while developing ever cheaper, more reliable energy sources from, for example, nuclear fission and nuclear fusion power through to solar where it's feasible to do so. The energy market should be unregulated as far as possible and consumers allowed to choose the energy sources they want, rather than it being dictated by politicians following the advice of so-called energy and climate experts. In particular, there's another executive order that focuses exclusively on Alaska, where environmental regulations will be limited or curtailed in order for liquefied natural gas and oil exploration and exploitation to commence. Moving on to a number of different executive orders, one example being defending women from gender ideology extremism and restoring biological truth to the federal government. There are a number along the same theme here. In conjunction with those other orders, which are about hormone blockers and gender reassignment surgeries for children and preventing trans athletes from competing in women's sports, we have confusion on both sides of this issue. Among conservatives, there is confusion about what the nature of personhood is. A mind, for example, has no gender or sex, and people are fundamentally minds. On the other hand, there is confusion on the liberal side of this issue. Sexually reproducing organisms have a defined sex, and among human beings, those with XY chromosomes, hitherto called men, are generally faster, heavier and stronger than women. Even if a person, assigned male at birth, undergoes surgery and hormone blockers, if they have passed through puberty, and almost all will have, they will have an advantage in almost all sports, and therefore rules around preventing men, or trans women, from competing in women's sports is a rational thing to expect. And that is basically the content of the executive order, keeping men out of women's sports, so it's titled. But this should, in general, be left to sporting bodies. Why the heavy hand of government is needed here is unclear. When it comes to conducting surgery and hormone blockers on children as young or younger than 5 years old, this would seem to not acknowledge the reality that sometimes children can be coerced by their parents into doing things they regret later. Some parents can coerce their child into undergoing surgery because the parent is captured by a fashion, a weird ideology, part of a cult to gain some cred or clout in a small community of people. As trans woman Blair White has observed, quote, "A transsexual child is like a vegan cat. We know who is making the decisions," end quote. This is not to not take children seriously, but rather to take them more seriously, because often their parents are not. This is a difficult issue to navigate, but it would seem that it simply appears to be the case that not enough is known, and the increasing number of cases, silenced until recently by woke ideology, of so-called detransitioners would suggest there is a very negative set of outcomes for a large proportion of those who seek to undergo hormone therapies and surgeries at a young age. To speak plainly, many come to regret it, and they feel they were pressured into transitioning by parents and a system, a medical system, and a system of psychology and psychiatry, which all too often was about affirming their bad ideas, rather than compassionately discussing and criticising where they might be making an error. In other words, much of the trans movement around children has descended into rank irrationality and a denial of reality, and somewhat cultish behaviour. None of this is to suggest that when a person has reached sexual maturity, that they should not be able to do whatever they like with their money and their own body so long as it does not hurt or cost someone else. But all of this is to suggest that the content of this and associated executive orders seem in line with a rational conception of the state of our knowledge with how to reassign gender and, perhaps more importantly, how to undo surgeries and interventions children may come to regret later on. One day, people may be able to routinely change their gender, or gender will not exist at all because we'll simply be minds, disembodied or something like that. But that day is not today, or on the foreseeable scientific horizon. See also the executive order titled Protecting Children from Chemical and Surgical Mutation. Moving on to an executive order about withdrawing the United States from certain UN bodies. This seems to be nothing but a good thing. UNRWA-funded terrorists, and alongside the United Nations Human Rights Council, the UN has become a deeply anti-Semitic organisation. It is good for the USA to try to correct the deeply entrenched error in ideology at the heart of the United Nations. This body is superfluous to the needs of nations who freely trade one with another and can enter bipartisan agreements or regional or cultural agreements. Supranational bodies like the UN and the EU are generally highly antagonistic to actual democracy. Their leaders are appointed, not elected, and once in power, exceedingly difficult to remove, despite their influence in global affairs and even day-to-day lives of people. The UN, for example, often guides the content of the curriculum delivered to school students across the world. There is an executive order titled Unleashing Prosperity Through Deregulation. Deregulation is a good thing. This executive order demands that if a new regulation is imposed, 10 will be eliminated. In concert with DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, headed by Elon Musk, if it achieves nothing else, it can at least highlight for taxpayers where their money is being spent and increase the critical attitude of citizens towards a bloated bureaucracy. Regulation, like taxation, dampens risk-taking and slows progress. Those who create wealth should be permitted to keep most, if not all of it, and reinvest in more wealth creation ventures. The government does not create wealth. Its purpose is to protect those who do, to protect the means of wealth creation, the capabilities of individuals and businesses, so that a society can become more powerful, more resilient, more quickly. The larger the government, the more government workers are required, and the more people are taken out of the wealth generation pool into the regulation pool. This is a recipe for a decline in accelerating progress. The executive order about defending America with its own Iron Dome is a no-brainer. The most important role for a government is the protection of the rights of its citizens, and that includes, obviously, from the threat of missile attack, whether that be from, in the case of America, from North Korea, China, Russia, or anywhere else. There is an executive order about restoring the death penalty and protecting public safety. However, I regard a person as a means of error correction, including of their own ideas. Even the worst could, in theory, be studied to find out what causes people to become murderous genocidal maniacs. Or people might be rehabilitated. Therefore, it would be wrong to restore the death penalty. Not least also because the state is fallible. There is an executive order about an America First trade policy. Well, that's in part about tariffs. Tariffs are always and everywhere a bad idea. They increase prices for everyone when enacted and only enrich governments who impose them. However, used as a bargaining chip, Trump seems to have had some good effect in cajoling the leaders of other nations to do what he wants in assisting his government and military to protect his borders. There is an executive order on restoring freedom of speech and ending federal censorship. Now, while the First Amendment in the United States guarantees the government already cannot impinge upon the free expression of people, nonetheless, it seems as if the federal government has used social media companies as proxies to do so, to suppress free expression, free speech, by pressuring them with the threat of fines, taxation audits, or investigation by the Department of Justice and so on. So this executive order seems to go some way to promising such pressure will not be exerted on channels of information and platforms from here on. Only a good thing. And that's just a few of the executive orders, but those were interesting ones that have caught my attention and the attention of many others. As we move forward over the coming 3 years or so, where Trump's administration is at their zenith of power, it is clear for many these are exciting, optimistic times. Others, we have to acknowledge, are fearful, already claiming Trump is overstepping his constitutional authority. No doubt the Supreme Court will intervene if and when required, and Congress may act as a brake on any true excesses. It seems good that rapid change is occurring. The checks and balances in the system provide for stability under rapid change. But if the executive orders turn out to be errors, they can be undone rather easily, either by Trump himself or his successor. In all cases, the measure of government policy must remain. To what extent does it allow more rapid progress without upsetting the system itself? Does it help to foster in an economy the ability for people to conduct trial and error in the market and in the marketplace of ideas? Are errors being detected and corrected more rapidly? Is the means of error correction under threat? Or are free speech, free trade and voting being protected? In the age of hyperbole, it can be like looking through thick mist to see what is actually going on. So much noise surrounds every action Trump in particular takes. The signal is sometimes lost, and so people tune in, so to speak, to channels of information that provide the comforting words one wants to hear. Beware of that impulse. The only solution to it's all interpretation anyway, and it's all opinions when media and social media become unreliable echo chambers, is to compare and contrast sources in your own mind. One needs not to be trapped within a framework of thinking or an echo chamber. One can understand the alternative perspective and ideas, and one has the capacity to come to a sober and objective conclusion about what is actually going on. It takes some work, but fruitful discussions using a critical method are possible and are the way to reach reasonable conclusions about what is happening, especially on topics as fraught as US politics and whether Donald J. Trump is a force for good or ill in the world. For more timeless discussion of these issues, visit Talkcast on YouTube and look for my recent breakdown of Karl Popper's The Myth of the Framework, where the greatest philosopher of the last century has written at length about how to think about confrontations and encounters when parties to the discussion are very far apart. There's never been a better time. If you'd like to support this ongoing endeavour, you can do so via Substack, or you can visit www.bretthall.org, where there are links to ways of supporting my content. Until next time.